Welcome back to the show. Today, I want to take you on a journey into the mind of a man who didn't just participate in a technological revolution, but who fundamentally rewrote the rules of human commerce, communication, and modern civilization. I want you to erase from your mind the image of the man you might know today, the sweater-wearing, philanthropic grandfather of global health. The man giving TED Talks about mosquito nets and next-generation nuclear reactors. We are going to strip all of that away. We are going back to the roots. We are going to look at a figure who, in the late 20th century, was viewed with a mixture of absolute awe and visceral terror. Today, we are diving deep into the early chapters of a fascinating book called Bill Gates Speaks, and we are going to explore the sheer, unadulterated duality of a digital titan. When we talk about historical phenomena, we usually talk about empires, wars, or sweeping political movements. Rarely do we talk about a single businessman in the same breath as a historical epic. But the central argument here, the thesis we are going to unpack, is that Bill Gates is not merely a programmer who got lucky. He is a historical phenomenon comparable only to the absolute titans of the Industrial Revolution. Think about Thomas Edison in the 19th century. When we think of Edison, we think of the light bulb. But Edison's true genius wasn't just making a piece of glass glow. It was conceptualizing and building the entire electrical grid that made the light bulb necessary. The book makes a brilliant comparison here, arguing that Gates is the Edison of Software. Before Gates, computers were these massive, cold, calculating monoliths made of iron and silicon. They were bodies without minds. Gates realized that software was the soul of the machine. Just as the light bulb was the soul of the electrical grid, software was what would make the personal computer an extension of the human brain. Gates was this incredibly rare, almost unprecedented hybrid, an inventor, a cutthroat businessman, and a master marketing strategist all rolled into one. And why does this matter? Why is this specific combination so historically significant? Well, Rich Karlgaard, an editor at Forbes, proposed a deeply philosophical argument about Gates that I think is just staggering. Karlgaard argued that Gates literally dissolved the ancient boundary between ideas and products. Think about this for a second. For all of human history, an idea was an abstract philosophy, and a product was physical commerce. If you wanted to sell something, you had to mine the steel, cut the wood, forge the iron. But in the information age, which Gates championed, the idea is the product. Software is nothing but pure, crystallized thought, written in logic gates, and yet it can be packaged, duplicated infinitely at zero marginal cost, and sold for billions of dollars. This erasure of the physical boundary made Bill Gates a new kind of philosopher-king of capitalism. He didn't build railroads, he built highways of the mind. To really understand the scale of what Gates did, you have to place him alongside the titans of the Gilded Age: Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Alexander Graham Bell. The late 1800s saw a massive societal shift, an invention boom that required strong-willed, almost tyrannical individuals who were willing to take massive, all-or-nothing bets. Rockefeller's Standard Oil became the bedrock of the U.S. economy by monopolizing the fuel that ran the physical world. Gates did the exact same thing, but with the fuel that ran the digital world, the operating system. But unlike Rockefeller, who dealt in a physical commodity that doesn't change, Gates operated in the hypervolatile high-tech sector. The primary challenge the book outlines for Gates wasn't just building Microsoft. It was ensuring Microsoft's longevity beyond his own lifespan, a feat almost impossible in an industry where today's cutting-edge innovation is tomorrow's electronic waste. But you don't build a monopoly of the mind without making enemies. And this brings us to the profound polarization that Gates caused. He triggered the deepest, most uncomfortable contradictions in American capitalism. On one hand, Americans worship success. We idolize the self-made billionaire, the dominance, the winning at all costs. On the other hand, we harbor a deep-seated resentment, and fear toward anyone who actually achieves total control. The public perception of Gates in the 1990s was intensely emotionally conflicted. Let me give you an example of just how dark this got. In the early days of the internet, there was something called the Bill Gates joke page. One of the most popular jokes on it went like this: "You are stuck in an elevator with a terrorist, a dictator, and Bill Gates. You have a gun, but only 2 bullets. What do you do?" The punchline? You shoot Bill Gates twice, just to be sure. That is incredibly dark. But it wasn't just anonymous internet trolls who felt this way. His own peers in the tech industry despised him. Mitch Kapper, the founder of Lotus, went on the record calling Gates ruthless and unethical. Kapper accused him of having winning at any cost mentality that actively stifled competition and destroyed innovation. Over time, the media narrative violently shifted. Computer World magazine documented this evolution perfectly, noting how Gates morphed in the public eye from the brave, nerdy entrepreneur fighting the giant IBM into a greedy villain who literally wanted to be the boss of the world. He was the hero who lived long enough to become the ultimate villain. But where does that kind of relentless, world-conquering drive come from? To answer that, we have to look away from the corporate boardrooms and travel back to his childhood in Seattle. We have to look at the boy they called Trey, who would later be given the moniker Young Jump by a Japanese manga artist, a perfect nickname that captured his restless, kinetic, almost uncontrollable energy. Even as a young boy, Gates was an intellectual rebel. He wasn't just smart, his intelligence was obsessive and all-consuming. At the age of 7, little Bill Gates decided he was going to read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z. And he actually made it all the way to the letter P, before finally moving on. He became intensely fascinated by Napoleon, perhaps foreshadowing his own future empire building, and he obsessed over the hard sciences of liquid, oxygen, and space travel. But this massive intellect came with a severe psychological duality. By the 6th grade, Gates was described as a rebellious, highly disruptive, and surprisingly poor student. He constantly fought with his mother. The tension in the Gates household became so unbearable that his parents actually took him to a psychiatrist. Now, listen to what the psychiatrist told his parents, because this might be one of the most pivotal moments in the history of modern technology. After observing this incredibly stubborn, brilliant boy, the doctor looked at his parents and said, "You will lose if you try to force him to obey." The doctor realized that Bill's mind was a force of nature. You cannot put a dam in front of a tsunami, you have to dig a channel and let it flow. The doctor advised the parents to adapt to Bill, rather than forcing him to fit into traditional, obedient molds. They listened. And by giving him that freedom, they unleashed a hyper-competitive juggernaut. And when I say hyper-competitive, I mean it in a way that borders on the bizarre. When Gates was 11 years old, his local pastor offered a challenge. Anyone who could memorize the entire Sermon on the Mount, that's chapters 5 through 7 of the Gospel of Matthew, would win a free dinner at the Space Needle. Young Bill Gates memorized it perfectly. Every single word. But the pastor later noted something fascinating. He said Gates didn't memorize those sacred words out of deep religious faith or spiritual awakening. He memorized them simply because it was a challenge. There was a prize, there were competitors, and Bill Gates intended to win. Period. This intense concentration manifested physically. From his days riding a childhood rocking horse, Gates developed a lifelong habit of rocking back and forth whenever he was deep in thought. If you watch old footage of him in depositions or boardroom meetings, you'll see it, this rhythmic, almost hypnotic rocking. It was the physical exhaust of a brain running at 1,000 miles an hour. But he wasn't just a bookworm, he was a natural-born capitalist. Even inside his own home, he was looking for an edge. At a very young age, he drafted a formal, written, legally styled contract with his older sister, Christy. The contract stipulated that he would pay her exactly $5 for the right to use her baseball glove whenever he wanted. He was treating his sibling like a vendor. But his real introduction to market economics came in 1972, when he was serving as a congressional page in Washington, D.C. A politician named Thomas Eagleton had been dropped from the Democratic presidential ticket with George McGovern. Suddenly, McGovern-Eagleton campaign badges were useless to the campaign, but Gates realized they were about to become historical anomalies. So, he and a friend bought 5,000 of these obsolete badges for 5 cents apiece. They then turned around and sold them to political collectors for up to $25 each. 5 cents to $25. That is a 50,000% markup. He was just a teenager, but his instinct for market timing, for recognizing artificial scarcity, was already world-class. The book notes that in many ways, Gates never really had to grow up, in the traditional sense. He was so successful, so early, that he never had to conform to the normal rules of adult society. He remained, at his core, that fiercely competitive boy. Years later, even as a billionaire, he met his match in Melinda French. At a party, she challenged him to jump over a table from a standing start. Now, imagine a multi-billionaire CEO of the most powerful company on earth at a party. Most would laugh it off. Not Gates. He squared up and physically jumped over the table, proving that his competitive drive, both physical and mental, remained completely intact. So, how does a kid who hustles political buttons turn into the architect of the digital age? Let's transition into his high school years, because this is where the raw intellect met the machine. Gates and his childhood friend Paul Allen were already legendary hackers at their private prep school, Lakeside. They were so good that the school actually asked them to write the software program to schedule students into classes. Now, if you give 2 teenage boys the keys to the school's social matrix, what do you think they're going to do? Gates and Allen quietly tweaked the algorithm so that Gates would be placed in classes filled entirely with the girls he liked. It's a funny story, but it was also a serious commercial success. They ended up earning $5,000 in computer time for that project. They were monetizing their code before they even had driver's licenses. But they also learned the brutal realities of business very early on. They had a workspace at a local computer company called C-Cubed. One day, C-Cubed went bankrupt, and the boys had to watch as the equipment was physically repossessed. For Gates, this wasn't just a bummer, it was a vivid, visceral lesson in the meaning of bankruptcy. It taught him that the business world is incredibly volatile, and that without cash flow you die. Around this time, Gates and Allen scraped together $360, a fortune for teenagers then, to buy an Intel 8008 microprocessor chip. The book describes how the boys treated this tiny piece of silicon as a sacred, mysterious object. They were almost afraid to touch it. They stared at it, knowing deep in their bones that this tiny chip represented the future of human computing. Gates later credited Paul Allen heavily for this phase. Gates was actually torn at the time between becoming a pure mathematician, a scientist, or following in his father's footsteps to become a lawyer. It was Paul Allen who kept pushing him toward hardware, toward microprocessors, toward the applied magic of computing. Their first real taste of professional, high-stakes programming came when a massive corporation, TRW Inc., encountered critical bugs in a PDP-10 computer system they were using to analyze power grids. Now, imagine you are a massive defense and infrastructure contractor, and your power grid software is failing. Where do you look for help? TRW looked in a problem report book, where users documented system errors. And they kept seeing the names Gates and Allen offering brilliant solutions. So, they hired them. What TRW didn't know was that their new ace debuggers were in the 9th and 10th grades. Gates actually took a leave of absence from high school to move to Portland to work on this. It was at TRW that Gates met a man named John Norton, who became his first real professional mentor. Norton was a legend. He was a guy who could supposedly memorize 5,000-page operating system manuals. He pushed young Bill Gates to his absolute limits. Up until then, Gates was a hacker, brilliant, but sometimes writing messy, sprawling code just to see if he could make it work. Norton wouldn't accept that. He intimidated Gates, but he also inspired him, instilling a lifelong habit of despising sloppy or lazy work. Norton taught him that code had to be elegant, efficient, and bulletproof. Gates returned from Portland a changed programmer, and he breezed through the rest of high school, capping it off with a perfect 800 on the math portion of the SAT. When his high school teacher wrote his recommendation letter for Harvard, she simply wrote that Bill Gates was more capable in mathematics than his teachers. And so, Gates goes to Harvard in 1973 as a National Merit Scholar. But Harvard, the pinnacle of American academia, felt stifling to him. He was a typical freshman in the worst ways. His room was a disaster, he was socially distant, he barely bathed. But his work ethic was terrifying. He would go on these 18 to 36-hour awake streaks, fueled by pizza and soda, ignoring the subjects he found boring and obsessing completely over the ones he loved. It was at Harvard that two vital things happened. First, he met Steve Ballmer. This is a crucial relationship. If Gates was the introverted, unkempt recluse hiding in the Aiken computer lab, Ballmer was the ultimate social manager. Ballmer was loud, gregarious, involved in everything from the football team to the Harvard Crimson newspaper. Ballmer provided the social networking and aggressive extroversion that perfectly balanced Gates' mathematical rigor. The second major event at Harvard was academic. In a computer science class taught by Professor Christos Papadimitriou, the class was presented with an incredibly difficult mathematical puzzle known as the pancake sorting problem. Gates didn't just solve it, he developed a solution that was so highly elegant, so mathematically complex and efficient, that it was published in the Journal of Discrete Mathematics in 1979. In fact, Gates' solution remained the absolute fastest known method for pancake sorting for decades. He proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that he had a world-class mathematical mind. He could have stayed at Harvard, become a tenured professor, and won a Turing Award. But the academic environment was just too slow. The world was moving, and Bill Gates could feel the vibrations. The turning point, the absolute catalyst for the rest of his life, happened in January 1975. Paul Allen was walking through Harvard Square when he saw the cover of Popular Mechanics magazine. On the cover was a picture of the MIT's Altair 8080. It was the world's first commercially available microcomputer. By today's standards, it was a joke. It had no keyboard, no screen, no software, and only 256 bytes of memory. It was literally just a metal box with blinking lights. But when Allen showed it to Gates, they both had a sudden, terrifying realization. The computer revolution wasn't some distant future. It was happening right now. And if they didn't jump on this train immediately, they would be left behind forever. They shared a vision that sounded like absolute science fiction in 1975. A computer on every desk and in every home. But to make that happen, that box of blinking lights needed a language. It needed software. So, what did these two college kids do? They pulled off one of the greatest bluffs in the history of business. They contacted Ed Roberts, the founder of MIT's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and claimed that they had already developed a version of the basic programming language for the Altair. Ed Roberts said, "Great, bring it down and show me." Here is the insane part. They hadn't written a single line of code. They didn't even own an Altair computer to test it on. What followed was an act of what the book calls reductive genius. Because they didn't have the physical machine, they had to write a simulator on Harvard's giant PDP-10 mainframe based only on the technical specifications they read in the magazine. Then, they had to write the basic language to run inside that simulation. Gates later described this 1975 basic code as the best program he ever wrote in his entire life. Why? Because it had to be impossibly tight. It had to be compressed into just 4 kilobytes of memory and still run fast. It was like trying to fit a symphony into a matchbox. Finally, the code was done. Paul Allen flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate it. And in a moment of pure cinematic tension, while he was in the air, Allen suddenly realized they had forgotten to write a bootstrap loader, the tiny piece of code that actually tells the machine how to read the tape, containing the basic program. So, thousands of feet in the air, flying toward a meeting that would define his life, Paul Allen scribbled the machine code for the bootstrap loader by hand on a piece of paper. When he got to MITS, he loaded the tape. He flipped the switches. And on the very first try, it worked perfectly. The machine typed out, "Ready." It was a miracle of engineering. That was it. The starting gun had fired. Gates took his second leave of absence from Harvard in June 1975. His parents were absolutely shocked that he was dropping out of the Ivy League to move to the dusty desert of Albuquerque. But they had learned the lesson from the psychiatrist years ago: you cannot force him to obey. They supported his decision. And so, Microsoft, originally spelled with a hyphen, was born. But even in these nascent days, Gates' ruthless business acumen was on full display. Although he and Allen had started as a 50-50 partnership, Gates went to Allen and negotiated a 60-40 split of the new company in his own favor. His argument? Allen was still receiving a salary as an employee from MITS at the time, while Gates was doing all the uncompensated heavy lifting of business development, writing contracts, and aggressive negotiations. Allen agreed, and eventually the split would widen even further. A very clear division of labor emerged that would define the company's early success. Paul Allen was the visionary. He focused on the horizon, on new technology and future products. Bill Gates, on the other hand, was the enforcer. He focused on the trenches, the business deals, the licensing contracts, the absolute destruction of competitors. There's a wonderful irony the book points out from this era. Bill Gates was the ultimate boy CEO. He was running a successful software company, negotiating with giants like Apple and Commodore, and earning hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet, when he traveled for business, he was frequently turned away at the rental car counter because he wasn't 21 years old. He was a teenager commanding a burgeoning empire, but he had to take a taxi to his hotel. But the scrappy, hacker-centric startup days in Albuquerque couldn't last forever. As we move into the early 1980s, the book highlights the crucial pivot where Microsoft transformed from a ragtag group of brilliant kids into a professionally managed global powerhouse. And the catalyst for this professionalization was none other than his old Harvard buddy, Steve Ballmer. By 1980, Gates was drowning. The company was growing too fast, the business demands were crushing him. And his friends were begging him to hire someone to manage the chaos so he wouldn't burn out. So, Gates reached out to Ballmer. The negotiation of Ballmer's employment is the stuff of legend. It took place over a crackling radiophone while Gates was vacationing on a yacht in the Caribbean brilliantly named the Duwa. Gates initially offered Ballmer $40,000 to be his personal assistant and business manager. But Ballmer pushed back, and Gates' advisors told him to pay the man what he's worth. So Gates upped the offer to $50,000, plus a percentage of stock options. That decision to give Ballmer equity changed history. By 1997, those stock options were worth nearly $7 billion. Ballmer brought the corporate structure, the aggressive sales culture, and the operational discipline that allowed Microsoft to scale. And scale it did. To give you some economic context of what they were building, the book notes that by 1996, the software industry, an industry that Gates essentially willed into existence, contributed $67 billion to the U.S. economy. It became the third largest industry in the country, trailing only automotive and electronics. But you don't build a $67 billion industry by working 9 to 5. The culture at Microsoft in the 1980s was one of extreme, almost fanatical intensity. It was a culture built entirely in the image of Bill Gates. Between the years 1978 and 1984, a 6-year period of his prime youth, Bill Gates took a grand total of 15 days of vacation. 15 days in 6 years. He led by example, and the expectation was that everyone else would bleed for the company just as he did. The Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington, was designed to keep you working. The cafeteria stayed open until midnight. And famously, anything with caffeine, soda, coffee, was absolutely free. It was a symbol of the high-pressure, high-intensity environment. They were fueling an army of coders to conquer the world, one line of code at a time. This relentless, move fast, break things culture inevitably led to massive collisions. And the most significant of these was the culture clash with IBM. In the 1980s, IBM was the undisputed king of computing. They were the men in the blue suits, the corporate monolith. Microsoft and IBM entered into a massive collaboration to build the OS/2 operating system. But it was a doomed marriage. IBM was bureaucratic, slow, obsessed with endless meetings and perfect documentation. Microsoft was a caffeine-fueled pirate ship, hacking together brilliant but messy code at 3 in the morning. It was the ultimate clash between the old physical world of hardware and the new, chaotic, intellectual world of software. And as we know, the pirates eventually won, leaving IBM in the dust and crowning Microsoft the undisputed ruler of the PC era. When you step back and look at these first few chapters of Bill Gates Speaks, what you see is the anatomy of a conqueror. You see the duality at every step. The brilliant child who had to be accommodated by a psychiatrist, and the ruthless businessman who squeezed his best friend for 60% of the company. The teenage hacker who just wanted to play with a sacred 8008 microchip, and the philosopher-king who realized that by controlling the software, he could control the entire digital reality of the human race. Bill Gates didn't just build a company. He built the modern world. And whether you view him as an Edison-like visionary or a Rockefeller-style monopolist, one thing is absolutely undeniable. The world we live in today, the screen you are looking at, the software running your life, is the direct result of a kid from Seattle who refused to be forced to obey. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.